Good morning. It is a beautiful day here in North Carolina, and today I'm going to talk about 7 things that every new bird photographer should know. So come along and enjoy this adventure. So probably the most important thing that you can do as a wildlife photographer is subscribe to this channel, select that notification bell, leave your comments below, and like these videos because this helps us in YouTube and it encourages us to make more videos. But the first thing I want to talk to you about as a wildlife photographer or bird photographer is equipment. And this is probably the hardest subject to talk about. Before you go out and buy any equipment, talk to other bird photographers. Talk to them what they do with their images. Look at their images on social media, see how high quality they are. Find out what they do. But basically you have 2 pieces of equipment here. You have a camera and a lens. Now the lens is where you probably should spend more money than on the camera because camera is like your computer you have at home. It has to be updated. It has to be, and it's like any other computer. After 4 or 5 years, you got to replace it because it just stops working or working right. Where your lens is something that you can keep going with different cameras with. Now, obviously, if you have a Canon or Sony or whatever, you got to stay with that brand. But that's what you want to do. So spend more money on your lenses versus your cameras. Now, cameras come in basically 2 different flavors. They come in with crop sensors, that's the sensor that records the image, and they come with full-size sensors. Full-size sensors tend to have a much better color absorption, much better light absorption. They record more information. So when you're editing the image, you have more flexibility with it. The crop sensor, though, the advantage of that is that your focal length becomes greater. So if I'm shooting at 400 millimeters with my crop sensor, which is the camera I'm recording with, you have to multiply that by 1.6 times 400, and that gives you about 580 would be the focal length if I was using this 400 millimeter on a crop sensor. I don't want to get into a lot of weeds with this because I can do a 2-hour video just on that. The second thing is the lenses. Now, you need at least a 400 millimeter lens. That's what you want to start with. And the reason why you want that is you want the biggest opening on this end you can because that's where all the light's coming in. The 400 millimeter you want something that is a little higher quality. Like cameras, lenses come in different flavors. The premium version and their not premium version. For the sake of argument, that's all I'm going to say about what it is. But this one here, and I have a Sigma 150-600. I've had it for a number of years. I love this lens. It's an incredible piece of equipment. I believe that the sport version is a much higher quality version over the Sigma's less premium version or contemporary. The sport is made out of metal where the contemporary is made out of plastic. There's a higher quality glass that goes into this lens versus the contemporary. The drawback to the sport is this lens is much heavier than the contemporary. I think it weighs almost twice as much as it does. It's got a metal hood. It's got a big metal foot here where the contemporary has a much smaller foot. It's much lighter. So if you're getting into bird photography, don't underestimate how weight can affect you because I find it tough when I'm carrying this thing 3 miles into the woods. I can begin to think to myself, this thing is beating me, not helping me. So that's something to think about. But another thing I want to talk to you about is used equipment. Used equipment is probably the best way that you can save money. This lens, brand new, costs about $1,800, and I know that it's December right now. I know that Sigma is going to raise their prices next year because they're coming out with a whole different version of this lens here. So now is the best time to buy this lens because this lens selling used sells for about $1,300. When Sigma comes out with their new version of this lens, this version of the lens will be even cheaper because people want to upgrade and they'll be selling their used equipment. So that's something to consider when you're buying equipment. Buy used, buy what you can afford, but buy the best you can afford. And it's better to buy premium versus the less premium brand. The number 2 thing that all beginning photographers need to embrace is that you need to take control of this little computer you have in your hand. Now, a camera comes out of the box in program mode. And the problem with program mode is that you end up in a situation where your pictures look kind of amateurish. They don't look very good. And the reason why is that the camera is trying to take your picture and turn it into every other picture that's out there, and it just doesn't work. You have to take control. So the first thing that you need to take control is the mode that the camera shoots in. Now, aperture priority and shutter priority and manual are the three modes that are every camera when they come out of the box. Now, they have other modes that are on there, but those three are always on every camera. Now, I'm not going to talk about manual mode because as a new bird photographer, you shouldn't be using that. So you should be shooting aperture priority or shutter priority. As far as either one of them that you use, it doesn't make that much difference if you're new. You're going to find your style, and that style is going to dictate which one of those you use. But aperture priority is you adjust the aperture and the camera adjusts the shutter speed. Generally speaking, that's the setting I use. For bird photography, I usually shoot with the aperture open all the way, or whatever, on that one there's 5.6, that's what I shoot at. Now, with shutter priority, it's just the opposite. You adjust the shutter to what you want, and the camera adjusts the aperture. Now, there's one last setting that we have to talk about, and that's ISO. And ISO is the sensitivity the lens or the sensor has to the light that's coming into the camera. Now, if you're shooting either one of these modes here, you're going to have to adjust the ISO to get the proper settings that you want. So for example, if you're shooting with a 400mm lens, you should be shooting twice your focal length. So you should be shooting 1/800th of a second. If you're shooting a 600mm lens, you should be shooting 1/1200. And those are the minimums you want. If you want to photograph like flying ducks, which fly very fast, you want to be shooting at 3,200, 3,000 to 4,000 of a second. And even if you're photographing even flying faster birds like peregrine falcons or kestrels, these birds fly extremely fast, and you might want to be shooting at 4/5,000th of a second. If you want to achieve those speeds, you're going to have to adjust your ISO. And as with everything else, if you want a shallow field of focus and you want a fast shutter speed, you're going to have to raise your ISO, or you're going to have to open up your shutter. But all these things are going to help you find your style. Maybe you want a deep field of focus, and that means that you want to have the aperture closed down a lot. Or maybe you want, like how I shoot, a very shallow field of focus, and that way you have the aperture open all the way to 5.6, and that gives you a very shallow field of focus. All this will help you get the images that you want when you get into this. Well, I had some problems with my camera equipment, and the last few tips weren't recorded. So I'm out this morning recording these tips. It's a beautiful cold day here in North Carolina. And today I want to talk about, the next tip is focusing on the eyes. As a beginner, as a new bird photographer, having the eyes in focus is very important. As human beings, we are programmed to look for faces, and the eye is a key element for the birds when we look at these images. To be drawn into the image, to have an emotional attachment to these images, you have to be able to see the eyes. As you become a more proficient photographer, you will develop your own style, and maybe the eye being in focus won't be as important. But as a new bird photographer, focus on the eyes. The next tip is focusing. I think this is something that a lot of people get confused about, because when you buy the camera, the salesperson or the website will tell you that this camera has hundreds of focal points. The problem is that even though it may have hundreds of focal points, it still can only focus on one thing at a time. So it's important that you limit which focal point to use. As a general rule, beginning photographers, I suggest you start with one focal point, the center focal point. You put that on the bird, and then when you get into your software, you can change the composition of that image by cropping, changing colors and stuff like that, stuff that you will learn as you become more knowledgeable about photography. And it's important that you get the image that eye in focus. You want the camera to focus in on the eye of the bird, and you want to have a very sharp focus image, because no matter how well the image, the composition is or anything else like that, if the image isn't in focus, it's not going to look good, and it's very important. So I strongly encourage you to use only one focal point. Light is what we do. We just record light, and light is a powerful tool. As you can see behind me, these trees, sunrise light is just hitting them. These gorgeous orange colors that are occurring. And that light will only be available for a very short period of time. As landscape photographers, you see them out there early in the morning waiting for that perfect light. The problem is, as bird photographers, we don't have the option to photograph the birds only at those few minutes after sunrise or the few minutes before sunset. We have to go out all day long and photograph them. So a general rule for bird photographers, especially for beginners, is that your shadow points to the bird. So if you're in a situation, you see a bird, you want to move around the bird, so, if you can, move around the bird so that your shadow is pointing at the bird. That way there you won't have any harsh shadows across the bird. You won't have any shadows. It will make your image a lot better. But now that I've told you the golden rule, I also tell you to break the golden rule. Kind of push yourself outside of your thing. Find your style. It's very important that you find your style. And one of my favorite images, and these are one of the first images I ever took as a wildlife photographer, is of a tree with 3 birds in it as sunset's occurring. It's a very dramatic picture. It's a very powerful picture in my opinion, and I love this image here. And I think it's important as a wildlife photographer that you follow the rules until they become inconvenient for you. And the great thing about digital photography is that you can always delete images that are any good. And as a photographer, you really should be pushing yourself. You should be experimenting, finding out what's best for you. And if you make mistakes, you don't get the pictures you want, you don't get the images you want, you can always delete them, because every picture you take, I think, is a learning experience. One last thing I want to talk about is binoculars. When I first got into bird photography, I didn't buy a pair of binoculars. I didn't understand why I would need a pair of binoculars plus my camera and my lens. And the reason why you need a pair of binoculars is that, first of all, it's much easier to scan the forest. As a general rule, these are more powerful than your camera. The other issue is that they have a much deeper field of focus. When you're looking through your camera, you have a very shallow field of focus. And that will cause you not to see the bird or be able to do it. And if you can't find the bird, you can't take the picture of it. I am a fanatic believer in this. So I want to thank you for watching. If you got anything out of this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to this channel, because that really helps us in the YouTube world. Become Patreon supporter. Your support allows us to keep doing this. My name is Sean Leahy, and thank you for watching.